The uncomfortable truth is this: Charles Ponzi didn't steal money by lying about returns. He stole it by exploiting time. Not deception in the cartoon villain sense, not forged ledgers or fake businesses, at least not at first. What Ponzi really figured out was how to turn impatience into profit, how to use arithmetic against human psychology, and how to make a system collapse so slowly that, by the time it did, the damage was already done. That's why this story matters right now, because every era thinks it's smarter than the last, and every era is wrong in exactly the same way. The 1920s weren't naive. They were optimistic. America had just come out of a brutal war. Industrial output was booming, credit was expanding, newspapers were filled with stories of ordinary people getting rich fast. The idea that money could make more money, quickly, was no longer fringe. It was mainstream. Into that moment walked Charles Ponzi. He wasn't born a criminal mastermind. He was born in Italy, to a family that had money once and lost it. That detail matters. Ponzi grew up surrounded by the ghost of wealth, the memory of status without the security of it. He immigrated to the United States in 1903 with a head full of ambition and almost no money in his pocket. Over the next decade, he failed at almost everything he touched. He waited tables, he worked as a dishwasher, he took jobs he hated and schemes that didn't work. At one point, he was imprisoned in Canada for forging checks. Later, he was jailed in the U.S. for smuggling immigrants across the border. By the time he reached his late 30s, Ponzi wasn't famous. He wasn't rich, he wasn't respected, but he had learned something valuable. He learned how money moved, he learned how institutions lagged reality, and most importantly, he learned that people didn't need certainty, they needed timing. The idea that would make him infamous came from something almost boring: international postal reply coupons. These coupons were created so someone in one country could prepay return postage for someone in another country. You'd buy a coupon cheaply in a country with a weak currency, send it abroad, and it could be exchanged for stamps in a country with a stronger currency. In theory, there was an arbitrage opportunity, and there actually was one, on paper. Ponzi realized that because exchange rates fluctuated wildly after World War I, a coupon bought cheaply in Italy could be redeemed in the US for stamps worth significantly more. If you scaled this up, the margins looked incredible. Ponzi claimed returns of up to 50% in 45 days. Here's the part most people miss. The idea itself wasn't completely fake. The math worked in isolation, but isolation is never how real systems operate. To generate the returns Ponzi promised, he would have needed to buy millions of coupons across Europe, transport them, exchange them, sell the stamps, and repeat the process continuously. The logistical burden alone was absurd. The global supply of coupons wasn't even remotely large enough to support the volumes he implied. But none of that mattered, because Ponzi didn't need the coupons. He needed the clock. He opened his business in Boston in 1919 and promised investors extraordinary returns with astonishing confidence. He spoke plainly. He dressed well. He seemed transparent. He paid early investors exactly when he said he would. That last part is critical. The first checks cleared. Word spread quickly. In immigrant communities, especially Italian Americans, Ponzi became a folk hero, a man who understood the system, a man who beat the banks at their own game. People mortgaged homes, they emptied savings accounts, they told friends and relatives, and Ponzi kept paying, not from profits, but from new deposits. This is where the math becomes uncomfortable. A scheme like this doesn't collapse because it's dishonest. It collapses because it grows. Every new dollar requires multiple future dollars to sustain the promised returns. The system isn't fragile at the beginning. It's deceptively stable. Early on, the inflows exceed the outflows. The founder looks brilliant. The skeptics look bitter. At its peak, Ponzi was taking in millions of dollars. In 1920s money, at a pace that overwhelmed banks. Some days, he was receiving more cash than the entire city of Boston's banking system. Regulators noticed. Journalists started asking questions. But here's the strange thing. When authorities investigated, Ponzi often appeared solvent. Money was coming in faster than it was going out. He could show balances. He could write checks. The scheme didn't break because someone discovered a missing dollar. It broke because someone asked a structural question. A reporter at the Boston Post did the math. He calculated how many postal coupons would have to exist for Ponzi's operation to be legitimate. The number was astronomical. More coupons than had ever been printed. More than the global system could physically supply. Reality finally caught up to the arithmetic. Once confidence cracked, the timing flipped. Investors rushed to withdraw. Inflows slowed. Outflows accelerated. The same math that had protected Ponzi now crushed him. Within days, the system collapsed under its own weight. Ponzi was arrested. Investors lost millions. Some were ruined for life. And yet, this is the part history tends to soften, Ponzi didn't disappear quietly. He became famous. His name entered the language. Not because he was the first to do this, but because he did it better than anyone before him. He refined the mechanics. He understood that trust compounds faster than interest. That visible success is more convincing than explanations. That people don't run from risk, they run from missing out. That's why the term Ponzi scheme stuck. But here's the unsettling part. If you strip away the accents, the coupons, the bowler hats, and the 1920s newspapers, what Ponzi built doesn't look like an antique. It looks familiar, painfully familiar. A structure where early participants are rewarded not by productivity, but by later participation. A system that depends on constant growth to stay solvent. A model where confidence is the asset and timing is the liability. Ponzi didn't invent that. He just showed how far it could go before collapsing. And once you see that, it raises a harder question. One that doesn't sit comfortably in history books or documentaries. Because if Charles Ponzi wasn't a genius liar, if he was a master of timing and math, then the real danger isn't fraud. It's systems that only work as long as no one asks what happens when growth slows. Because that question, what happens when growth slows, is where the story stops being about Charles Ponzi and starts being about everyone else. After his arrest, investigators went through Ponzi's books expecting complexity. What they found was almost disappointingly simple. There were no sophisticated ledgers, no intricate webs of shell companies, just stacks of investor deposits and a basic pattern of redistribution. Money came in, money went out. The timing did the rest. Ponzi served several years in prison. After his release, he tried to chase the same magic again, in Florida real estate of all places, selling land he didn't own in developments that barely existed. The scheme failed quickly. The world had learned his name. He was eventually deported to Italy, then drifted through Europe and South America, dying in poverty in Brazil in 1949. The man who once handled millions died with almost nothing. History often treats that as poetic justice, a neat moral ending. But that framing misses the real lesson. Ponzi didn't fail because people stopped believing in fast money. He failed because his personal credibility was exhausted. The structure itself never really went away. In fact, it got better. Over the decades, the mechanics Ponzi demonstrated were repackaged, sanitized, and scaled. They became harder to spot not because they changed, but because they blended into legitimate systems. Some were illegal, some were legal. Some lived in a gray zone where outcomes depended entirely on timing. What all of them shared was a dependency on new participants. Take the most famous modern example, Bernie Madoff. His operation lasted decades. It survived market crashes, recessions, and regulatory oversight. Not because the returns were real, but because withdrawals were predictable and confidence remained intact. Madoff understood the same thing Ponzi did. People don't check systems that keep paying them. They check systems that stop. But the idea goes even deeper than outright fraud. Strip away criminal intent, and you still find structures that behave suspiciously like Ponzi's machine. Any system where returns to existing participants depend disproportionately on continuous inflows from new ones carries the same mathematical tension. It doesn't matter whether the language is criminal or respectable. The arithmetic doesn't care. That's where things get uncomfortable. Because once you recognize the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Investment vehicles that promise consistent, market-defying returns without clear explanations. Corporate growth models that rely more on financial engineering than actual productivity. Entire sectors valued not on cash flow, but on how convincingly they can sell future growth. None of these are automatically scams, but all of them share a vulnerability. They only work if expansion continues. Ponzi understood this intuitively. That's why he moved fast. That's why he paid early and loudly. That's why he cultivated an image of momentum. He knew that the greatest threat to his operation wasn't exposure, it was stagnation. When inflows plateau, math stops being friendly. This is why the phrase, "it works until it doesn't," isn't a cliché. It's a mathematical truth. Compounding doesn't forgive pauses. Systems built on perpetual growth don't break slowly. They appear stable, then fail all at once. And here's the subtle psychological trap. The longer a system survives, the more legitimate it feels. Time itself becomes evidence. If it hasn't collapsed yet, people assume it won't. That assumption is incredibly powerful. It silences skepticism. It reframes doubt as ignorance. It turns caution into cowardice. Ponzi benefited from that effect for months. Madoff benefited from it for decades. Others are benefiting from it right now. What makes this especially dangerous is that participants don't feel like victims while the system holds. They feel smart. Early adopters are rewarded. critics are mocked. And when collapse finally comes, it feels less like a crime and more like a betrayal of physics. Something that always worked suddenly doesn't. Looking back, people ask why no one spoke up sooner. But that question misunderstands human behavior. Most people aren't looking for structural integrity. They're looking for confirmation. As long as checks clear and dashboards stay green, the underlying mechanics remain invisible. Ponzi didn't need to convince people that his postal coupon story made sense. He just needed to convince them that everyone else was already making money. That lesson aged frighteningly well. Today, the tools are more complex. The language is more technical, the participants are more sophisticated, but the core equation hasn't changed. If returns require constant new capital, the system is borrowing time from the future, and borrowed time always comes due. This doesn't mean every fast-growing system is doomed. Growth itself isn't the villain. The danger lies in confusing growth with sustainability, in mistaking momentum for resilience, in assuming that because something survived the past, it is insured against the future. Ponzi's story forces an uncomfortable reframing. He wasn't a financial magician, he was a stress test, a demonstration of how far trust can stretch before math snaps it back. The real reason his name still matters isn't because of what he stole, it's because of what he revealed. He showed that fraud doesn't require complexity. He showed that belief scales faster than scrutiny. And he showed that the most dangerous systems are the ones that don't look broken until they are. So the lingering question isn't whether another Ponzi could happen. It's whether we'd recognize one if it didn't wear a villain's face. Because if a system rewards you today using tomorrow's money and everyone agrees not to ask what happens when tomorrow arrives, at what point does confidence stop being faith and start being denial?